Excavating Shipwreck Lecture Theatres. And for those of you watching it in your cabins, a very warm welcome to you as well. Over the next 4 lectures that we have while you're on board, between now and the 4th, we should be talking about different things in relation to our work underwater. And the first one is probably the foundation stone in relation to everything that follows. And so I'm delighted that so many people have come to learn about the first one, which we then progress as we go from step to step. And today I'm going to be talking about what is maritime archaeology, the very basics. We're going to be talking about the ship's construction that we see. And we're going to be talking also about the tile wreck, which is a project that the team has been working on over the last decade or so. We're then going to be talking about in another lecture, the Dragon, 1783, the last French warship lost in the American Revolutionary War, and the forensic analysis that has enabled us to identify the vessel. We're going to be talking about another French wreck called Le Casimir, the perfume bottle wreck, that was so named after a large quantity of lead crystal perfume bottles, which were unique. And then hopefully we'll finish up with the Battle of Frigate Bay and a wreck we're working on in St. Kitts, which is not too far from where we're heading. In fact, all of these wrecks are based in the Caribbean. And one has to remember that the Caribbean was the cornerstone, the stepping stone for the discoveries in the New World during the period that I'm going to be talking to you about, which is basically post-Columbus. So, without further ado, let's just move on. A little bit about ourselves, the Anglo-Danish Maritime Archaeological Team, or ADMAT for short, set up by myself and a Danish marine archaeologist. We realized that, especially in the Caribbean, there was a large amount of work that needed to be done. The governments didn't really know how to do it or what to do, or they didn't have the appropriate people. And we had a team of divers, enthusiasts, who wanted to, on a volunteer basis, make their bit, make their part of their holidays count towards something very important. The dedication that we have from a whole world range of enthusiasts and individuals is the preservation and the protection of underwater cultural heritage, as well as educating governments and having a voice for the people, so to speak, to make sure that the governments do the right thing, and to enable students and divers to take part and to actually learn. It's a non-profit organization. We have students and personnel from all the way around the world, and all of us are volunteers. We set aside our holidays and our time to actually make it happen. We start off with ADMAT USA, which are based in the United States, and we have ADMAT France. ADMAT France is a subsidiary organization based at the Institute of Paleontology, the National Histoire Museum in Paris. Because most of our wrecks are French, now as an English person, I find that interesting. A number of my French counterparts asked me, said, "Simon, we don't understand it. After 300 years of battles between the English and the French, you, an Englishman, are trying to protect French wrecks." And it's an interesting question that we will have to work on. But we work with the Louvre, we work with leading museums, because they have the expertise to analyze a whole range of artifacts and look at them from a forensic viewpoint. Based at the Institute of Paleontology, here we are in Paris. And this is Dr. Francois Jourdan. He's from ADMAT France. He's at the Louvre Research Center. It's 11 layers below the Louvre that you all know. This is their neutron reactor. And we're very privileged to have an association with them. We sent some of our tiny lead crystal perfume bottles to be analyzed by algae. And algae is this $20 million piece of machinery that starts over here and ejects a neutron blaster ray that comes out of this pinhole over here. And when we were doing the work, we were very privileged. We had to stand back because the Mona Lisa was just coming out from having some work being analyzed. So one of the first things I want to quell is, what is the difference between treasure hunting and archaeology? A lot of people, they watch the Discovery Channel, and they see treasure hunters going for the gold, going for the big wreck and so forth, and they believe that is archaeology. Unfortunately, that is not the case. There's a big difference between treasure hunters and archaeologists. The main one is that treasure hunters have shareholders. They're predominantly aimed at making a profit. In certain countries, they steal artifacts that do not belong to them, because the artifacts under law, maritime law or otherwise, belong to somebody. It's not a question of finders keepers, which is a misconception. From an archaeological viewpoint, we have the methodology. What happens? How do we do the archaeology? How do we keep the artifact collection preserved and intact for future study? How do we provide public access to it? How do we produce the best scientific analysis that we can? These are the two differences in relation to archaeology. And under the United Nations UNESCO organization, most treasure hunting organizations, thankfully, are no longer in existence. And we've had some interesting times in the Caribbean. You heard about pirates from my learned colleague yesterday. Well, I can assure you piracy certainly goes ahead when it comes to underwater cultural heritage. There's a network of people who will steal cannons, anchors to order, and it sometimes can get a little bit dicey when you're trying to protect things from people who want to steal it. But maritime archaeology happens underwater. And I was asked for what is a very short description of maritime archaeology, and I scratched my head and thought, well, hold on. Best thing I can think of is history, mystery, and Baywatch. And that is basically what we have. The media love it because it's something exciting. Most people watch the Discovery Channel and dream that they can actually take part, do their little bit. Wouldn't it be exciting? They all read, some of my friends have been writing books. Clive Cussler, for example, I've had the privilege of speaking to a number of times, and I read his books and I think, wonderful, wonderful. If only I had the resources that Numa has in relation to all the good work that he has. But it keeps archaeology alive in the public perception, which I think is very important. So let's just go through what UNESCO basically describes. What is maritime archaeology? It's a scientific study through the surviving material of all aspects of seafaring. And as I said, nearly everything is underwater. We have to look at ships, boats, craft, together with all their ancillary equipment, cargoes, passengers that were carried on them. We have to take into account the personal effects of the officers and crew and differentiate that from the personal effects of the passengers. It does relate to certain artifacts that were buried and are no longer buried. In Netherlands, for example, when they were draining some of the polders, you had a ship that was underwater, now it becomes on land. And therefore, the discipline of maritime archaeology prevails as the principal investigative source. The main thing is that, let's face it, ships are designed to go from A to B. They're not designed to be underwater. And we have shipwrecks because disaster strikes. And how that disaster strikes will often dictate what is the left of those artifacts, what is the remains of the hull. For example, in Ontario, where I used to run the archaeology up there for the government, everything is, because of the cold water, is standing upright. You can see a ship there, cannons out the side, mast and everything else. In the Caribbean, everything is buried, and you basically have to work it out. And the forensic analysis of what we call the wrecking process, from when it leaves the surface to all the way to where it ends up now, it leaves a trail of breadcrumbs. And it's looking through those breadcrumbs, trying to work out, sift through the important clues that will enable you to put some qualifications and comments as to the wrecking process. Another way of looking at it is like a 30,000-piece jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the box. Jigsaw puzzles are hard enough it is without the clue. The quality that we have remaining will depend if it blew up. Was it capsized? Did it run aground? All these things will have an effect. And the survey and excavation process from start to finish, well, we have to survey to locate the target. Now, a lot of people think that's relatively straightforward. We have to take the geographical information, the general information for the area. We get a lot of information from fishermen who spend all their lives on the reefs and around. And we go into the archives. If we're very fortunate to find the information in the archives, unfortunately, there's no X marks the spot. That is a preview of Hollywood. In reality, if you're lucky, it says it's lost somewhere on the North Coast, lost somewhere in the Caribbean. Well, I can assure you, the Caribbean's a very large place. So we have to work extremely hard to find that exact location. And then our work begins underwater. Le Casimir, which is one of the other lectures, the trail of breadcrumbs, so to speak, is 1 mile long that we have to follow. And so we have to use a lot of important geophysical equipment, what we call magnetometers and gradiometers, which are designed to measure the difference in the Earth's magnetic field in relation to any iron objects that may be around. Well, we can find a World War I battlecruiser 3 miles away. Wonderful. Unfortunately, historic shipwrecks cannons, anchors, one or two, very little iron. And so we literally have to run over them to find them. We use side-scan sonar. This, for example, is HMS Fowey in Florida. Side-scan sonar sends out acoustic beams at 45 degrees to the hull. When it hits something, it bounces back, a bit like radar underwater. And it creates a picture. And here, for example, you can see the hull, the lower hull of this ship with all the timbers and everything else. This is one we did at Isabella, which was the first settlement in the New World, looking for one of Columbus's flagships. And here you can see where the boat is moving along, and here you can see the reefs, and they're coming very close to the fish that we're taking into account. So training is crucial, that we make sure that we don't lose any expensive piece of equipment because we've accidentally banged into the coral reef. Here, for example, you can see the reef on this side, and here you can see all the sand waves, the undulation of the sand dunes underwater. And this gives us a lot of important information when we're looking for shipwrecks. The third type of equipment is what we call a sub-bottom profiler, designed for work in the North Sea, and it sends a beam going through the Earth's crust, effectively, and if it hits something hard, it bounces back. The only problem with this is, I personally believe you need a PHB and Ouija board interpretation, because the pictures and imageries that it gives you is so difficult to analyze. And we're looking for differences in the substrata, and waterlogged wood is mainly water. So it's very, very difficult. So when we find what we believe is the wreck, we then have to work on a grid. We use a 1 meter square PVC piping system for our grid. And here, for example, you can see a new grid that we put on the Casimir site this July. And we then work out a visual survey, design the grids on land, transport them to the site, and put the whole thing together and start work. Plan the survey, follow the survey. Unlike land archaeological sites, when you have all the time in the world, we have a very short window in which to get out into the field with all the disciplines that are required for marine archaeology and actually make it happen. One of the first things we have to do is a biological assessment. And fish are friends. Well, most of the time they're friends, unless, of course, you get attacked by a lionfish and get bitten by one of those. The work required will also depend on the wreck site. Here we have Le Casimir, relatively straightforward. Here we have what we call the Fayence wreck, 1760 vessel, where it was so rough you couldn't have a grid on site because it wouldn't survive. So we have to adapt and change our methodology depending on the circumstances. We have to uncover the overburden of sand to enable us to look at the wreck site. And we use two types of equipment. One is what we call an airlift. That's basically a pipe which you pump air in. Air rises to the surface, creating suction, and therefore enabling you to remove the sand that you have. And disadvantages are that it requires a roadside compressor, very heavy, it needs a bigger boat because of the equipment, and can only work below 10 meters of depth. The second method, which we use mainly, is water dredges, which basically use water. It goes around a little device that we have here, creates suction, and allows us to hand fan and to remove the sand from there. And you'll see some illustrations on some videos later on. It works very well in the shallows. We can use small boats, which is good. It does need somebody at the other end, what we call tail end Charlie, as everything goes down a tube and comes out at the other end. That is all the non-artifacts. The artifacts are looked at, removed by hand at the front. The sand goes through the back, and the tail end Charlie at the end of it is there as a fail-safe, just to make sure tiny little beads or something like that may go through and therefore can be recovered. When we find the artifacts, we have to photograph them. They're measured, they're looked at. We only remove them if it is required by the archaeological provenance and the requirements of that site. The ship's timbers we generally leave in situ because they're very difficult for conservation, and we will literally tag them, record them, and draw them, and enable us to put a scale plan together, and you'll see some of those later on. We carry on until we have got all the information that we can, or until we've run out of time for that season, and then we cover up the whole site. Here you have one of the archaeologists painstakingly measure square by square underwater. This, for example, was uncovered. It is a lead crystal whiskey tumbler. It's black as a result of the chemical reaction between the seawater and the lead crystal. rather a nice thing. Unfortunately, it's got about 75% lead crystal, so I'm not too sure whether the quality of the malt whiskey would protect you from the lead poisoning that you might incur. So as soon as the artifacts are recorded, they are returned back to base, they're tagged, they're logged, they're catalogued. We need to know where they came from, what is the relationship with other artifacts. We have to have a photograph of them. We have a whole list of information, and on the sheet we get more and more information: who did it, when did it, how did they did it, the color, texture, and condition. So we're getting as much information as we can, and then that is all tabulated, as we see here, very, very simple codes, classification, subclassification, and then it goes into what we call conservation, because most of these artifacts, certainly for seawater sites, have salt in them, and this is a real danger to the artifact. So we have to do freshwater conservation to basically remove the salts from it, and this is done by the students. And some of the artifacts can take many, many years or even decades to remove the salts. In particular, cannons and anchors are very problematic. And when you're talking about conservation, you've got to think before you touch an artifact. As an archaeologist, we owe a duty of care to that artifact. We've got to work out what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? The difference between a cannon and an anchor weighing 3 tons and a pewter eminer pump is different, but they all need a plan before you even touch them. Here, for example, we have a soup tureen dish, French faïenceware 1760. We left this in situ, even though there was a high risk to whether it would be there because of the looting on the site, for the simple reason it was underneath 50 grinding wheels. We couldn't physically move it without risking the artifact, and so we sandbagged it and left it in place. But anchors, cannons, and various other things go into freshwater conservation, where they stay for many years as we slowly remove the salts from all the artifacts, whether it be iron, whether it be pottery, whether it be faïenceware, whether it would be bone. The diagnostic artifacts are then drawn. Here we have a drawing of an artifact that was recovered from a looter. He unfortunately broke it, much to our chagrin. And what you have here is the residue of iron. When it rusts underwater, it sticks to the sand and forms basically a cement, what we call concretion. And after painstaking research and conservation, we remove that concretion. And here, for example, you can see ivory handle, bronze and gilt-covered pommel for the sword. And it was made by a chap, J. Coleman, in Charing Cross in London in 1768, the same sword maker as Lord Nelson and a number of other distinguished British captains. A very important piece that had been saved from the looters. We have other wooden artifacts here, for example, pulley wheels that are in excellent state of preservation, even though they've been underwater for 300 years. Olive jars, as you would expect from the Caribbean theatre, faïenceware, sugar bowl lids, survived quite well considering it was in a tumble dryer of sand and rock and everything else in the area. And the final stage is, after full conservation, they're photographed for publication, reports are made, placed in the museum so that everybody can actually see. And then we rebag the site and protect it and do a final biological survey. And publications are obviously a very important part of our work. Museum display here, we have one in the Ferro Cologne, which was opened by the Pope, and has over a couple of thousand pieces of French faïenceware from 1760s wreck. And yet the quality of them is quite amazing considering they have been underwater for such a period of time, as well as cannons and all the other exciting things as you would expect to see. So what do we see underwater? A lot of people think it's a bit like Hollywood. There's the ship, the skeleton man at the wheel and the sails flapping. Unfortunately, it's not like that at all. Here we have a classic schooner, yet all that's going to be remaining will be the lower hull, and in particular the keel, the floors, the keelson. These are the backbone pieces of timber that hold the ship together. And here, for example, you can see the ribs of the ship as it goes round the sides, and that will be full of cargo, and that's more or less what we would find. Here, for example, a cross-dimension of an American ship called the Eagle, which gives you an illustration. We're looking at the lower parts of the hull, and the bow is one of the most important parts and most complex parts that we can find. Obviously, everybody knows what an anchor is. The longer the shank, for example, this part here, the older the anchor. The larger the ring, the older the anchor. Because technology was brutal in those days, it needed very thick, wide ropes to move the anchor. As technology improved, things got smaller. So let's talk about the tile wreck. We don't know the name of this vessel. It's one of the things we spent many years on, and we're looking for that final diagnostic clue that will pave the way for the discovery in the archives, as we have with Le Casimir and the Dragon. But going back since the days of Columbus, Dominican Republic, which is here, I think we are somewhere at the moment off the Turks and Caicos. I could be wrong, but I think that's more or less where we should be by now. That was the center since the days of Columbus and the first historic settlement. Every ship in the old world who wanted to go to the new world would come to the island first of all. And therefore, because the wind blows from the north, we basically have a ship trap. And we estimate just for 100 miles where we're working, we've got somewhere in the region of 450 historic shipwrecks in various different states. So the tile wreck, what do we know about it? Well, basically, when we first looked at it, we knew absolutely nothing about it. It was covered by mud under the mangroves in about 4 meters. We thought it was a very small wreck initially, and in 2000, when we first looked at the site, we found parts of the lower hull, the ceiling, the cargo, the keelson, the main mast step, very important parts. But as we analyzed a bit further and looked at the forensic analysis of it, we found that, for example, she had 2 hulls, one to protect from the worms that would eat its way through. So if they eat the way through the sacrificial planking, the hull is actually intact. We started building a grid, as I've illustrated, and over the years, we've been working on it piecemeal, part by part. We found numerous cannons, anchors, the cargo of granite pre-cut blocks, which I'll be talking about, and probably some in the region of nearly 9,000 to 10,000 artifacts, which are going through conservation. And this is one of the first pictures. As we remove the mud, we're going down and down in stratigraphy. There we started finding rows and rows of tiles. Tiles, what are they doing in a ship? Where did they come from? Why are they all the same size? What was its purpose? These are the questions that we had as we started looking at the tiles. We took each tile, measured, recorded. We have somewhere in the region of over 1,000 of them now. Some of them are really interesting. For example, we've found puppies' paw prints. We found fingerprints. We found children's fingerprints. Interesting, the children are being used as possibly child labor. The time period we're talking is around about 1720. We've looked at them from microanalysis, we've used electron microscopes, we've tried to work out where did the clay come from. And we've managed to narrow it down to the Louvre Valley, near a town called Nantes, on the western seaboard of France. But there's only so much that one particular clue can you get from it. One of the cannons, there were 7 cannons on the site, and they unfortunately were stolen by the looters in 1999. This is the only photograph we have of the cannons, and that too was stolen. So cannons can give us a lot of information. Who made them? When were they made? What's the size of the ship? And so we had to go from ship's construction, and we had a little bit of blue and white pottery started coming up. Here we have a plate, for example. At the time period, it was done in blues, and that was very common for Delftware. So we thought, possibly, should it be from Holland? When we looked at the ship's construction, here, for example, we're looking at the mast step. It's cut into a certain part of the ship called the keelson, and it goes vertically up. Now, tradition says there should be a gold coin placed underneath the mast for good luck. We didn't find one. Possibly that's an omen. Who knows? But either way, the coin would have helped us because it would have given us a date. The timbers themselves gave us ship's construction information, which enabled us to date it to the latter part of the 1690s. But nevertheless, no smoking gun as to where it came from. We could see that it had been uncovered and recovered due to all the wormholes and the fact that the worms had burrowed their way through the timbers, attacking it. We then started finding granite blocks, blocks upon blocks upon blocks, hundreds of granite blocks. All of them have been pre-cut. Now, granite is very, very hard rock. Why are we cutting the blocks? Why are we sending them halfway across the world at that time period? Very expensive. Why? What's the purpose? What's the mission? What is this ship actually doing? And those were the things that we had to take into account and answer. We started using geophysical equipment over the site, and some of the equipment wasn't good enough. This fellow here is using a metal detector. Unbeknown to him, there is a cannon about 7 feet below him. but the metal detector wasn't good enough to pick it up. We started finding clay pipes. Now, pipes are good because they can be used as a diagnostic dating tool. And this particular one helped us because it had a stamp on the bottom. We thought, great. Looked up the reference point, 14 within a pearl string, date made in Goa, in the Netherlands, 1690 to 1810. Okay, so we've got a starting point, but we haven't got a finishing point. We need to look at something else that might give us a clue. There we've got different typologies of pipes and so forth to go through. We looked at the sherds, and one in particular turned out not to be blue and white. Here we have a bird in green. Now, green at this time period was an unusual color for the European makers. So we're wondering why? How did that come from? Is this one of the first changes of color as far as the French faïenceware? This is a faïenceware design. It's not porcelain. And here, for example, we've got a nice plate. This would be a decorative plate for the wall. It had a hook to hang it. And what you have is a huntsman with a big floppy hat and a musket. The missing part would show his horse, and he's off riding through the woods. A very nice scene for the time period. Here, for example, we have a carpenter's wood blade that will be used by the shipwright. And attached to it here, we have a French faïenceware beaker. It doesn't have a handle, so it's not a mug, it's a beaker. And they have been stuck together by this concretion. Here we are slowly measuring and recording the hull. And here we have an important part, the keel, which gave us a lot of measurements and a lot of information. The anchor, this is what an anchor looks underwater like. That's buried, you can't see it, so you have to dig for it. And we went down about 4 feet for one of these. Cannon. But the interesting thing on the cannon is it's upside down. Why is it upside down? Well, it's upside down because the captain wanted to lighten the load of his ship. He realized he's almost on the verge of running aground because the depth of this wreck site is 7 feet deep. That's not big for a ship that could be somewhere in the region of 100 feet long. Now, allow for a storm surge that would heighten the waves, but he wants to get rid of weight on his ship. So he's going to roll the cannons off the side. And as he rolls the cannons off the side, gravity takes effect. The cannon will flip upwards and rest with the heaviest part, which is the barrel, in the sand, and it slowly works its way down, and the gun carriage is on top. As the gun carriage is eaten away by the worms and the storms, the bars supporting the gun carriage fall on top. And here, for example, you have the bars. Here we have what we call the cap squares, which go over the trunnions, which are like the hinges, and clamp it to the actual gun carriage. And so that was, for example, is what we call cannon number 1. This is one of my favorites. It's so small, it's very easy to miss. We only found one of them. Now, this belonged to a gentleman. It is a pewter cufflink. And on one of the sides, it had a crest and had an emblem of a palm tree, which is interesting. We're still trying to work out whether we can attach that to any heraldry and so forth. But nevertheless, an important and small artifact to find. We found hose and axe heads and so forth, which would be general cargo for the Caribbean. This, for example, here, we're using geophysics, and underneath, this is what we found, another anchor. Well, we're catching up with anchors. We found 3 anchors so far, but we haven't found the best anchor, which is what we call the best bower. And that would have been the main anchor that might have been used to save the ship from being run aground by the storm. These were in the hold. They were never deployed. They never had the time to deploy them because of the sinking process, which is what we are working out. Here we've got a very large concretion. It's what we call a deadeye. It's used for the rigging. And we're lifting it from one side to the other and eventually taking it back to the base where the students are drawing and recording it. And one of the things we found was the deadeye material itself is made of lignum vitae, which is one of the hardest woods. It's self-oiling to stop the friction from the ropes causing a fire and burning. And this lignum vitae was charred. It was burned. Well, we know it's on the sides of the ship, so on this particular side, we know there was a fierce fire that literally charred one of the heaviest woods and strongest woods around. So again, it's another clue to put into the whole picture. Here we have a bladed object. You can see it there. Here, the handle would go down, and it would be on a 6-foot pole, and it's a boarding pike. At the other end, there is a skewer, and the idea is to stop the enemy from boarding your ship. Most people would have a sword, you see, so a sword has a certain element of distance. If you've got a 6-foot-long pike, with a spear you can either impale them, slice them, or dice them, as they say, using the blade that looks like a machete. A useful tool for going into pirate-infested waters of the Caribbean to make sure that your ship is not overrun. Here we have one of the cargo blocks. Obviously, we can't go into port and have big cranes like we have today. Everything was done from the main mast and the yard arm and so forth. And these are important ship's construction and ship's artifacts that tells us clues. We try to photograph and record all that we are doing. And in this particular wreck site, unlike the others, there's a lot of mud from the mangroves, a lot of sedimentation, which unfortunately does cause havoc with the cameras and trying to get good pictures. But as we uncover here, for example, you can see the granite blocks are now getting tighter. You can see the clear-cut lines as to they're there. Why are they there? We started recording them, and we started taking core samples from them and sending them back to Paris for analysis. And about 7 months later, Francois said, "We've got it. We've got the quarry that the granite blocks came from." Well, clearly that's a major piece of detective work, and they've done wonders over in France to determine where this came from. It's another clue, but the question is why? Why take the granite blocks, spend all the money and time cutting them in France and sending them all the way across the world? We were missing that piece that would give the information together. Here we have French faience-ware. This is a handle from a large storage vessel or jug. There you see there's 2 of them next to a pipe. Here we have a very nice bowl. You can see that the lead glaze has reacted with the salt water, a bit like the whiskey tumbler that I talked about earlier, and you could see the dark discoloration as a result of that, as this is slowly being uncovered. We always try to have the north arrow in the pictures for archaeological purposes. It puts us in our perspective to always know where north is, and we work in metric, so we have a scale that puts it all together. This is cannon number 3, and from all the positions of the uprights and so forth, we can determine that this also was pushed over the side of the ship to lighten the load of the ship. More tiles going down, and then we start coming to the hull in various places. And in some places, we didn't find anything at all until we started finding these. And we thought, well, what on earth is it? It's clearly a long piece of squared timber. Where does it match on the ship? Rustling through papers, trying to work out what we had. What we have are skid beams. And they go across the middle of the ship at deck level, so that if you imagine you've got sidewalks, you've got a hold which you can access in the middle, and the beams go across, of which the lifeboat, or the longboats as they were then known, were resting upon them. And they're called skid beams. The idea is that they were detachable when you wanted to load the cargo and so forth. And this is what we have here. We were hoping for some graffiti or a sailor that might have put his name or something that might give us a clue. No, all we did get was axe marks and so forth, but nothing that would yield us a diagnostic. Cannon number 2, we found, went through the bottom of the hull. And the cargo of tiles collapsed on top of it, burying it. And so here, for example, you see all the tiles that are put together. And getting ready to lift it was quite an exercise, because we had to bring it 2.5 miles through the mangroves, winch it onto a truck, take it to the center without breaking anything, or in particular one tile. And so here we have an interesting thing of how not to get hit on the head by a cannon as you're actually trying to film it. You can see all the tiles are nicely stacked, and they're glued together with this type of concretion that we have. We have a cannonball over in the top right-hand corner as it goes off. We've got various pieces of French faience-ware that are stuck all into the matrix. And in the end of the mouth of the cannon, we got a ramming rod that was used to move the cannon round so that they could send it over the side of the ship. Some nice clues as a result, but again, we're missing the smoking gun as to what that name of the ship is. The anchors, again, as I showed earlier, they're on their way back, dragging them, suspended by lifting bags, all the way through the mangrove swamps, back to base, where they were winched, as I said, on top of a track-bed truck. Every now and again, we get a diagnostic, and this is where things get really exciting. Here we have is a French bowl. A bowl, you say? Well, what's so exciting about it? Well, if you look at it, you can lovely see a clear orange color in the decorative paint on the French faïenceware, and a design of flowers and so forth. And research into the archives, a year later of painstaking work, we found the same design of the Solanaise flower bowl. It was from the Never foundry in the Loire region of France, and this was only made between 1720 and 1723. So we now have a time frame in which the ship must have sailed and sunk, because this was an export from France to the rich colonial landlords in the Caribbean, because they wanted all the nice things that their counterparts were having back in Paris. So nevertheless, we have a bowl. Unfortunately, because the site has been attacked by looters and so forth, it's not intact, but there we are. Nevertheless, you've got a lot of exciting information from that paved the way for the date of the ship. We have to also remember the Catholic Church had a very important power over this time period, 1720s. Here, for example, we have a nice cherub, the cute little wings and the face, and it's pierced. You can see a lance that's going through the breast there. I actually personally like the hands. I think the artist has done quite well doing those. And that was just one of the plates that was found in pieces, but nevertheless, a striking remembrance of the importance of the Catholic Church during this time frame. We have other lovely scenes. Here we have a farm building, probably near the Loire Valley, where the ship actually sailed. The painters obviously putting designs. There's no transfers in those days. They have to do everything by hand, glaze it, scratch off the edges, reglaze it, which is how it gets the color distinction over a number of firings. I love this one. It's an 8-legged bumblebee, or what appears to be an 8-legged bumblebee. I want to know, how many legs do bumblebees have? Have we discovered an extinct species of bumblebee that was in France? This is one of the few intact pieces that we found, and it's a stoneware mug, relatively straightforward, but it was underneath a 3-ton anchor. How it survived, I have no idea. But it's one of those exciting things. We leave the surface in our 21st century equipment. We go through the water, and we go down, in this case, only 7 feet deep, and we're touching the 16th and 17th century. Very few places in the world where you can actually do that. You're transferring yourself back in time to work out the mysteries associated with the wreck. Very rare to find rope and so forth. Here we have some rope from the anchor, still in existence. Very, very difficult to remove, let alone conserve. To remove that section took somewhere in the region of 3 hours to make sure that it survives in the conservation lab in excellent condition. Rope is, you look at it and it falls apart underwater. It's kept there because it has been buried by the sand, and the oxygen has not allowed the microbes to demolish it. So as the picture of the wreck starts, here we have the mast step that we were talking about. Here we have the cargo deck, the granite blocks that we mentioned, the hull beams. Here we have the tiles up there, cannons and so forth. We found a swivel cannon, which was particularly exciting. Very rare to find a breech loader, let alone a wrought iron breech loader, which is much earlier than the wreck itself. It probably would have been quite an old piece. We found tiller bars here, for example, and spares to steer the ship. We looked at the rudder. Now, in the tail end of December 2013, we found a new section of the rudder. A lot of excitement all around. But here we have the type and design of the rudder. We've got the pintles and the gudgeons. The pintles are the hooks, the gudgeons go onto the ship, and it hangs on those positions. And the rudder obviously is one of the most important parts of the ship. Without a rudder, you're going nowhere. And we originally found what we thought was the rudder, and we still do, but we found the trailing edge of the rudder, and we were missing the leading edge. Here, for example, we have a photograph of there's the trailing section. You can see the pintles that go across. This is the section that we're missing. And it's about 12 feet long. Interesting as I unfortunately haven't got time to go into the how it's made up, but it had a very unique construction. We had emergency steering position underwater, which is a sign of a warship, because if you're going into battle, you want to be able to steer the ship. If the primary steering, the tiller is destroyed, you can steer it by chains pulling left or right, like a go-kart. Well, this was underwater, which would have made it easier to protect the ship. And this was a new section that we looked at. And as you can see, the question we have is, did it match? And this is something, unfortunately, science would not allow us to confirm. And I'll show you a brief video, if we're lucky, towards the end of it. Another artifacts, we found grenades. Now, what is grenades doing on a merchant ship? It's very rare. Here we have, it's a hollow cannonball filled with gunpowder. The gunpowder was still in the cannon. It had a wooden fuse, which you can see here. We had to take a bit of health and safety to make sure we didn't ignite them by accident, because you never know. And we found about 35 grenades. What on earth are they doing, all fully armed and ready to use? We tried to work out what is the construction of the ship, and here we have some illustrations as to what we believe the tire wreck would have looked like round about the late 1600s when she was built. We don't know whether she was an armed merchant ship as a primary source, or whether she was a merchant ship that was armed. Two distinct definitions. Of the time period, merchant ships were called into battle whenever the crown decided to go and attack somebody. And so the more cannons it had, the more important. But for the Caribbean, with the island of Tortuga not too far away, yes, Johnny Depp and all the funds of the Caribbean and so forth, you needed to protect your ship from all the bad guys that would like to come along. And this, I believe, is probably the best example of what the tire wreck looked like. It's a model by Hoving. Around about 1670s, ours would have probably been about 20 years later on after that. And at the moment, we're looking through all the forensic analysis of the broken pieces in France at the National Ceramics Museum and putting them together. So, for example, this piece here comes from there. So we now know what that big vessel would have looked like. These three pieces come from this vessel here. So it's piecing together all the pictures, which takes a considerable amount of work. So in summary then, what have we got? Well, we clearly knew that the ship was stuck in a storm. It needed a safe anchorage. It was as simple as that. She was pushed in to the shallows, probably by the storm gauge. We believe a hurricane would have finally pushed her in there. A fire certainly was on board. The probable cause is a ship's lantern below decks that would have been used for illumination. It would have crashed on one side, probably ignited it. There would have been a fierce fire that would have raged through a certain side of the ship before the water came in and extinguished it, which is why we've got lead drippings and various other things that are petrified in their state as the lead from the musket balls has flowed in one direction and the water has totally cooled it down. We know that there was a lot of looting at the time, and the whole thing was covered with mud, and over a period of time it was forgotten. And I'll see whether this little video clip will actually work. What we're now looking at, excuse the shakiness, is the new part of ship's rudder that we're looking at. As far as the granite blocks, we were fortunate enough in the archives to find the answer. At the time, France ruled the island, and she needed fortifications against the English. And she realized that the local stone, ironstone, sandstone, was pretty poor. And therefore they came up with a solution that they would transfer granite stone from France all the way to the Caribbean to build this new fortification at Cape Francis, which is now Cape Haitian in Haiti. They needed massive sea defenses and a very large fortification. And to do that, they needed tons and tons of pre-cut granite blocks that were put together like a child's Lego construction. So it was very simple. They thought, well, hold on, we can't afford to send merchant ships with all this stone over. I said, well, simple. The military in charge. We will make it a royal decree. Every ship heading towards the Caribbean will carry our granite blocks free of charge for us, for the glory of France, and we will solve the problem of transportation. Thank you very much. That's dealt with that one. And so all these pieces went, and somewhere there must have been a plan as to how to reconstruct all these pieces that were put together. But we know that all the granite block was destined for the new fortification in Cape Francis, which was built later on. So we're looking at this clip, and I'm just going to run it for a couple of minutes. Timbers, obviously underwater, starts getting eaten away, and these little hollows that you see here are what we call worm tubes. The worms have burrowed their way through the timbers, and they have left the calcareous residue of their shells as they progress through the tunnel, digging, pushing it out, digging, pushing it out. And we have various grooves that might be associated with those iron bars from the other piece. But again, because we didn't find one, it's very difficult to actually tie it in. Looking along the top of the blade of the rudder, or part of it, we found square nail holes. Now those nail holes did match and fitted in very nicely. But we found also remember I was talking about the pintles and the gudgeons? Here we have them. They are the same distance apart. I thought, great. But one of the clues from the other rudder section was that it was covered with horsehair and tar to prevent the worms from eating it away, and another layer of planking, like a secondary layer, to protect it. This one did not have it. Here, for example, you can see the nail holes that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Here we have a concretion that's coming across. Here you have the hinge. Remember we were talking about the pintles, the points that would go into a hole for the rudder to swing on? Well, this is one of them. This one here is in good condition. The other ones further along have been bent as a result of the wrecking process. In other words, the rudder was a little bit lower than the bottom of the ship. As it went into the shadows, it was literally ripped off the back, and as a result of that, we went on. So, where do we go from here with this particular wreck? Well, we will continue until we find the smoking gun. We've known so much about this little ship as a result of the archaeological surveys. And these things take time. I always say to my students, a ship will let you know her name when she's ready. She's been there for a couple of 100 years. She's on her own timetable. And they do have personalities. You go down there and you recognize some of the things. On some of the ones for Le Casimir, which is another lecture towards the end of the cruise, you're looking at the ship's construction, and we had a board of inquiry that said certain things were badly built on that ship. Well, they didn't know for sure. But when we went underwater, we could prove beyond a shadow of doubt that the court of inquiry in 1829 was absolutely correct, putting the forensic examination together. So we will be leading a team in February, a couple of months from now, and we will be returning to the tower wreck, as we do twice a year. And slowly but surely, we are piecing the pictures and will work out the story and the name behind the tower wreck. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for listening to me.